The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.
Oh, don't forget, I need donations and to thank people for donations, because I've got a big project I'm going to be starting next week.
We're recording.
Oh, sorry.
Joseph does have a huge project that he is beginning, and it will require some donations. So make use of the PayPal button that you'll find on his website, GeorgeAnn.com.
And GeorgeAnn, I do want to thank people so very much that helped with the move. There's one lady in particular who helped so very much, and you know who you are.
Yes.
God bless you. And as you know, I'll tell you some more details off the air about this big thing, but in fact, I may be slammed with two big things beginning next week, so... But I've already, I finished one, just before you called, about 45 minutes, I finished the book I was working on, and am itching to get started with the next one, so there we are.
Okay. Tonight, we're going to do part 2 of The Philosopher's Stone and the Magic of Social Engineering. Joseph.
Yeah.
Everybody that listens to the Byte Show knows that you are a meticulous and brilliantly gifted researcher and a prolific author.
Well, thank you.
And I just want to say that because it's the truth.
Well, thank you.
And let's get started. What are the farm hall transcripts?
Oh boy, those are something I talked about beginning way back with the first book in the Nazi series of books, a book called Reich of the Black Sun.
Yeah.
And the subtitle of that was called the Post-War Allied Legend and Nazi Secret Weapons, or something like that. I don't even remember the titles to my own books. But I first mentioned them there, and I mentioned them again in the book called The Philosopher's Stone, which is what we're talking about.
Yes.
They are the secret recordings that the British made of some of the captured Nazi nuclear scientists. There were 10 scientists that were taken to Great Britain after the end of the war. They were interred in a place called Farm Hall in a big British manor house.
Mm-hmm.
And their conversations were recorded secretly by the British. They were not declassified until very, very late. I think, right off the top of my head, it was sometime in the mid-'80s to early '90s, somewhere in that time frame. And they were translated and edited by a fellow by the name of Jeremy Bernstein in a book called Hitler's Uranium Club. All right?
Yeah.
And if you read them, they make for some very, very revealing reading, because, for one thing, in them it is clearly revealed by one Nazi scientist that they did have an accurate measure of the amount of critical mass of uranium-235 that would be required for an atomic bomb. The estimation of this one scientist was within the same estimations of Allied estimations for the time period. So in other words, we are not, once again, dealing with an incompetent nuclear program. It has been argued by some authors that Heisenberg, who of course was the most famous of those physicists that were taken there, that Heisenberg dramatically and drastically overestimated the amount of critical mass that was needed by orders of magnitude. And and that for that reason some authors argue that he either deliberately sabotaged the Nazi project, or others argue that no, the man was just incompetent when it came to nuclear engineering, which is patently untrue, because if you read my books carefully, SS Brotherhood of the Bell in particular talks about the fact that Heisenberg had constructed a nuclear reactor in Leipzig in 1942 for the express purpose of what was called tickling the dragon's tail. In other words, taking a certain amount of uranium and bringing it close enough together that it would start spitting out neutrons so that they could get an accurate read of thermal neutrons that would be needed to explode an atomic bomb. So in other words, it was very, very dangerous work. Well, Heisenberg, in the process of testing this concept in 1942, let it be noted, had his reactor catch fire in Leipzig, and it was kind of the first sort of Chernobyl incident, quite frankly, because the reactor burned and burned and burned, of course, and the Nazis had a great deal of trouble putting this thing out. But the point is that we are not dealing, first of all, with an incompetent nuclear program. The second thing, and it's very, very critical, the second thing that is mentioned in those transcripts is when the German scientists are listening to the BBC, of course, reports on August 6, 1945, that the Americans had dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima.
Yes.
And immediately what happens in the transcripts, if you read them, is the German scientists all sit around and decide they're going to figure out how the Allies did it. And the discussion immediately turns to the normal logical thing. Well, how did they enrich enough uranium to build an atomic bomb when we couldn't do it, all right?
Yeah.
Now, this is an important point, because I have argued repeatedly beginning in Reich of the Black Sun, that the German atomic bomb project was actually 3 projects, and that the Nazis very deliberately kept the well-known big-name scientists out of involvement of that project precisely for security reasons, because had those scientists been kidnapped by the Allies or alternatively assassinated by the Allies, and in fact both the British and Americans were contemplating secret operations of that nature. So in other words, the Nazis took the logical step to keep these big-name scientists more or less out of the loop of what was really going on. That, in my opinion, is what was happening. So these scientists didn't even know what was going on in their own country within the SS to develop an atomic bomb. So anyway, they sit around and they decide to figure out how the Allies did it. Well, the first fellow that speaks up is, of course, Werner Heisenberg. And he says, well, we could have done it if we had had 10,000 men too, and been able to have all the labor and money that the Americans had, all right? So the first point I want to point out is that the Nazis had gazillions of bodies for labor in the slave labor camps, in the concentration camps.
Yeah.
So in other words, they weren't short of labor at all, and this, again, is what I argue in Reich of the Black Sun, that much of this took place in the concentration camps, specifically at Auschwitz, because the labor was expendable, and it was a perfect way to keep secret research secret. All right? So at this point, when Heisenberg mentions this, another German scientist by the name of Fritz Wirtz pipes up, and he says, oh, well, you don't really need that, because what you do is you take isotope and then irradiate it at a certain wavelength. And then, GeorgeAnn, all of a sudden, all of the other scientists start talking all at once as if to drown him out. Okay?
Yeah.
And then when the conversation calms down again, it resumes, and a fellow by the name of Paul Hartek responds to Heisenberg, and he says, oh, well, you don't need 10,000 men for that. You only need 10.
Only
okay?
10.
Only 10. And then he says, I was amazed at what I saw at IG. And then there's a little footnote, and the editor and translator of these transcripts says IG Farben. And that's all he says. He doesn't comment on what Wirtz had said about irradiating isotope with a wavelength.
Yeah.
Nor does he comment any further on Hartek's amazing statement that the Germans apparently had some sort of isotope enrichment technology that did not require the tens of thousands of laborers that the Americans were using at Oak Ridge with thermal diffusion gates and cyclotrons and what have you, but only required 10. Okay? And then he goes on specifically to mention I.G. Farben as possessing this technology. All right? So no one knows what's going on here. All right?
Yeah.
And in the Philosopher's Stone, in the last section of that book, I tell you what's going on. Okay? Because it is, in a way, a purely alchemical technology that is being suggested here. Because, again, you have the idea of wavelengths of light. You have something to do with I.G. Farben. You've got some technology that's so advanced, so far in advance of anything the British or Americans are thinking of in terms of enrichment technology, that it doesn't require the tens of thousands of laborers to run. Okay?
Oh, my.
Oh, my. And you know what it is?
What?
It's laser isotope enrichment.
Oh.
And let me explain why I think this is what they were talking about. To enrich isotope with laser beams requires, first of all, that you possess something called a tunable gas laser. All right? That was one of your questions that you read to me before we started talking on the recording. Well, what this means is, if you think of a standard laser, most people think of a laser as having this little cylindrical crystal in it with two mirrors on each end, only one of which is partially silvered, that allows the light to bounce back and forth and then emerge through that partially silvered mirror as a laser beam, right?
Yeah.
Well, instead of taking a crystal, you make the lasing cavity a gas, all right, of a particular chemical compound, all right? And you excite the gas so that it will start to kick loose a lot of photons, electrons, and so forth. The light will bounce back around between two mirrors, one fully silvered and one partially silvered, just as in a solid-state laser. But the difference is, depending on the gas that you put into that lasing cavity, the light will emerge at a different frequency, all right?
Okay.
Now, this is very important because, first of all, what's I.G. Farben's specialty? Gas. All right? The second thing is every nuclear isotope has a particular, very narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum that it is resonant to, all right? So in other words, if you have turned a bunch of uranium into a gas, well, within that cloud of uranium gas, you're going to have atoms and molecules of U-235, and then you're going to have atoms and molecules of a lot of other stuff, U-233, U-238, and so on and so forth. But what you want are those atoms and molecules of U-235, okay? So what you do is you polarize the gas electrically, and then you beam the very exact frequency that U-235 is resonant to through that gas. And what that will do is it will collect all of that very, very pure U-235 on electrical plates.
Oh, my.
And then you separate it chemically, because any isotope of uranium will respond chemically to chemical processes, the same as any other isotope. So that part of separating it is not that hard once you get it on the electrical plates. You just got to get it on those plates first. So in other words, what the Farm Hall transcripts are telling you is, if you read them carefully, that these Nazi scientists are talking about a second-generation isotope enrichment technology that doesn't become publicly known until about 1979.
Oh, my.
That's why those transcripts were classified for so long, because that little exchange between those scientists is an indicator that the Nazi atom bomb program was not incompetent by any stretch of the imagination. Now, here's the final nails in the coffin, GeorgeAnn. I believe that technology had been used at I.G. Farben's so-called synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz concentration camp. It was an enormous plant that was built by I.G. Farben right around, I would say late 1939 and in early 1940. It was huge. It cost 250 million Reichsmarks to build. In today's dollars, that would be about $2 billion. This is an enormous, enormous facility, all right?
Okay.
Now, here's the problem. Number one, and I think I've talked about this a way long time ago, very briefly in our Cosmic War series. Number one, this plant consumed more electricity than the entire city of Berlin.
Okay. Oh, my gosh.
Yes, oh, my gosh, that's right. Because, at that time in history, Berlin is the 8th largest city in the world. I mean, it's an enormous city. So, in other words, the point is the electrical consumption is way off the chart for anything that you would need for making synthetic rubber, okay? Mm-hmm. Number two, when the I.G. Farben executives were put in the dock at Nuremberg because they had been using slave labor at this plant in the tens of thousands, okay?
Yeah.
They testified that during the entire 4 years of operation of this enormous synthetic rubber plant, guess what? Not 1 ounce of synthetic rubber was ever made. So in other words, they're telling you that the world's most technologically sophisticated chemical cartel in the world was overseeing a plant for 4 years that was a complete and total disaster, which of course is nonsense.
Yeah.
All right. Now, the final nail in the coffin that we know is that this facility in Auschwitz that Farben built was subject to numerous breakdowns, all right?
Yeah.
And to me, that's the clue, that one of the technologies that they're using there to separate and enrich uranium is precisely laser isotope enrichment, because what are you going to have to do if you have already in 1941, 42, somewhere in there, a tunable gas dynamic laser technology? Well, you're going to have to test that technology on various isotopes and learn the resonant frequencies by brute force trial and error. And that would explain why the technology kept breaking down. But I think it's clear from the Farm Hall statements that by the end of the war, they had something going there at I.G. Farben that only required 10 technicians. And in fact, laser isotope technology, enrichment technology, is a technology that is not labor intensive. You just, turn on the button and power up the laser and shoot it through a bunch of gasified isotope, and you've got your separator. It doesn't require anything more than turning a few dials and throwing a few switches.
Oh my gosh!
So it's a very, in a certain sense, it's a very simple technology.
What about switching nuclear isomers on and off?
Well, let's get to that, because that's part of this story.
Okay.
The final nail in the coffin that I reproduce in The Philosopher's Stone that is clear testimony to the fact that the Nazis were working on lasers is a document that was part of what we recovered and declassified, once again very, very late, that testifies to a Luftwaffe project where a scientist is stating that he, drawing up a list of talking points, and the last one mentions the term Kaskadenprinzip, or cascade principle. Now, the reason that's important is because that is the exact physics principle that is in use in lasers. All right? It is the very term for how a laser works. All right? Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that the physics existed for lasers in the 1930s and 40s. The term laser did not. All right? But it's always been something of a mystery to historians of science as to why it took so long for the laser to be invented when the technology was fairly simple and the physics existed. Well, my answer is it was invented much earlier than we've been told. It was invented in Nazi Germany, and it was part of a very successful Nazi atom bomb project. That's why.
Oh, my gosh.
So now we get to isomers. And what was your question again?
What is the switching of nuclear isomers on and off?
All right. Let's if we haven't discussed isomers before, I don't know if we have or remember if we have or we haven't, but a nuclear isomer is a special kind of isotope of a radioactive element that is in an extremely high state of spin. In other words, the nucleus of the atom is turning around and around and around on an axis of rotation really fast, okay? Now, what isomers will do, or can do, is if you get them to de-excite, in other words, if you sort of, so to speak, slam on the brakes of this spinning nucleus, what will happen, and can happen, is number one, that isomer will spit out gobs and gobs of very deadly gamma rays, okay? The second thing that can happen is that these isomers, as they're spinning around like this, can spontaneously fission, all right? Now, this is very important because this, too, is something that was only publicly announced in the physics literature beginning in the very late 1970s and then continuing on into the 1980s, all right? Prior to that point, it was commonly accepted that atoms could only split if they were bombarded by fast-moving thermal neutrons smacking into the center of the nucleus and splitting up a bunch of neutrons and protons, just like a cue ball hitting a cluster of billiard balls on a pool table, right? Follow me?
Yes.
All right. But isomers can do this on themselves without neutron bombardment. Okay? They can just, so to speak, fly apart.
Oh, dear.
Atoms, in other words, atoms spontaneously fissioning. And the real big surprise to nuclear scientists that were, releasing these papers publicly in the 70s and 80s was that almost any isotope that had an isomer could do this. You were not limited to splitting atoms of uranium or plutonium in the transuranic range of elements on the periodic table. You could actually have this taking place in isomers of boron, much further down in the periodic table, isomers of mercury, and so on and so forth. Well, it's significant for us here because one of the big mysteries that the Allied scientists could not explain, and you cannot find explanations of this today in the conventional literature on this subject, is as they went into Nazi Germany, and we talked about this the last time, they were discovering that the Nazis stockpiled massive amounts of thorium, and of course, the Nazis told the Allies, well, we're using this to develop a whitening ingredient in a toothpaste. Yeah, and if you believe that, folks, I've got a bridge to sell you, too. But there is an isomer of thorium called 229 thorium isomer that will spontaneously de-excite at a very low threshold. And again, a tunable gas dynamic isotope separation technology would be the ideal way to separate isomers if you are wanting to collect a lot of it. So this is all, again, tied together.
Burkhard Heim.
Oh, boy.
His theory, why is his theory only available in Germany?
Well, let's set the background. Burkhard Heim was a German physicist that actually did do some sort of work for the Nazis during World War II, all right? And he was very, very young at the time. And in the Philosopher's Stone, I point out that Heim had actually approached Werner Heisenberg when he was a very young man of 18 and suggested to Heisenberg that he had an idea for, and now listen to the words very, very carefully, an idea for a clean hydrogen bomb, Okay? Now, the reason that's important is let's go back to our basic physics and engineering of a standard hydrogen bomb. The standard way that you detonate a hydrogen bomb is by an atomic bomb, okay? Yes. The atomic bomb is the fuse that achieves the necessary pressure and heat gradients to slam a bunch of hydrogen atoms together and make them fuse, all right? And, of course, the fusion gives you a much bigger bang because, of course, you know, the sun essentially is nothing but, in certain models of physics, is nothing but a huge chained-up hydrogen bomb. Of course, I don't accept that those models are anywhere near complete, but nonetheless, they're true as far as they go.
Yeah.
So, in other words, what Heim is saying is, oh, looky, I have an idea for a hydrogen bomb. In other words, a really big bang that's entirely clean. In other words, you don't need an A-bomb with all of its messy, nasty radioactive fallout to set it off. Okay?
Oh, my God.
Oh, my. Yes. Oh, my. So, you know, and it's important for people to realize a hydrogen bomb is several orders of magnitude larger than an atom bomb.
Yeah.
I mean, they are just enormous, enormous weapons, and there theoretically, really, is no limit on how big you can build them, all right? In fact, the Soviet Union in I think it was 1961 or 62, actually detonated a hydrogen bomb with a yield of 57 megatons.
Oh, my God.
That's the explosive power, equivalent power to 57 million tons of TNT.
Oh, my gosh.
In other words, this was just an absolutely gargantuan weapon. But anyway, Heim is significant because he was doing some sort of work for the Nazis during the war, and to this day it is not known what. But I strongly suspect that he had some sort of connection to the Bell Project, and here's why. After the war, Heim went to work for the German firm of Messerschmitt Bellco Blohm, all right? Mm-hmm. And he began to develop a hyperdimensional physics unified field theory for the sole and express purpose, in his mind, of making an efficient form of space travel possible. Now, let's remember the time period here, the mid-1950s.
Okay.
Heim quit working for Messerschmitt Bellco Blohm, but he never quit working on his theory, all right? He died only recently, in fact, I think 2000 or 2002 at some point. You can go online and find pictures of the man, kind of a distinguished-looking man. But he developed this theory, and I suspect that he was so afraid of it falling into the wrong hands that he only published it in German, and even then, GeorgeAnn, he would only let a New Age publisher in Vienna publish it.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. There was something very peculiar about the man. He kept guard over that theory very, very carefully. The significance of the theory is this. It's very, very important to understand this. Heim developed a hyperdimensional theory of 6 dimensions. Later versions were in 8 and 10 dimensions. But the important thing is this man was so brilliant that he was able to predict the masses of particles prior to their discovery from first principles on the basis of his theory. And in some cases, those predictions have borne out.
Oh my.
The second thing is that this theory is, from a certain standpoint, a huge advance over string theory in that, number one, it's engineerable. In other words, Heim was not interested in just having a theory. He wanted it to have a practical application that could be used for advanced field propulsion and space travel. Now, the importance of the man is that he came to the attention of NASA through the AIAA Association, Engineers Association, that published a couple of papers of some of his associates based on his theory. And he has come to the attention of NASA. So in other words, this guy is not a fly-by-night. But whatever he was doing for the Nazis, I think, was somehow part of the formulation of his theory. I think that he had some connection to the Bell Project, and that he was the one that more or less, after the war, drew up some of the theory connected with it.
Oh, my.
Yeah, oh, my.
Well, what were the experiments that went on with a death ray?
Oh boy, this is a major story, and it's one that is very, very hard to, track down. There were rumors beginning circa 1942, 43, and continuing into 44.
Okay.
From the Eastern Front, and again, that's a crucial little detail, and I'll mention why. Most of the German advanced weapons, I believe, were actually either tested or used on the Eastern Front simply for two reasons. Number one, it was a way of ensuring that they would be kept quiet, because Stalin would never admit publicly that he was fighting a technologically superior enemy.
Yeah.
Okay. Number two, as far as the Nazis were concerned, all of those Slavs in Eastern Europe were sort of second-class humans. So in other words, as far as they were concerned, best to test them on those people.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, it's, again, it's part of this sick, twisted Nazi mentality.
Yeah.
But there is a story beginning in 1943 that the Nazis tested some sort of secret weapon on their own troops on the Eastern Front, and you find stories that this weapon was tested on Russian troops in the late period of the war in 1944 in Romania, and it's the Romanians themselves that tell this story. The difficulty is determining exactly what the Nazis were testing, because they, again, we're dealing with a regime that was pursuing every oddball project it possibly could to bring these advanced technologies to fruition.
Yeah.
So we simply do not know what is meant by these death rays in these contexts. Were they testing some sort of scalar weaponry? Were they testing some sort of intense microbeam? Were they testing some sort of laser? Were they testing some sort of sonic weapon or particle beam? We simply don't know, GeorgeAnn.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
Well,
I think they did happen, however.
They evidently killed quite a few people with whatever they were testing.
Yes, I think they did. Again, and the reason I think that these stories we have to credit is because, number one, there are too many of them. Number two, they're coming from different places on the Eastern Front during the war. And number three, there are different people telling them.
Yeah.
And number four, the details of how the weapon affected people, the details themselves all differ. So this is the problem. I think we're not dealing with any sort of confabulation here, because there are too many differing details, but yet the stories are too frequent and come from so many different sources.
Yeah.
So I think we have to credit them.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
It just seems like there's no line that they will not cross.
No, there wasn't.
Oh.
There wasn't.
Well, and it's still that way, Joseph,
yes.
in warfare. It's still that way.
Well, yeah, I hate to agree with you, but yes, I think so, because, the Allies certainly didn't have clean hands either, and neither did the Russians. The firebombing of Dresden and the firebombing of Hamburg and wholesale slaughter that took place in Japan with the firebombing of Tokyo and other Japanese cities. No, the Allies did not have their hands clean either. So, I think the sad fact is that warfare all too often becomes the means where the only way to describe them as grisly technologies are oftentimes tested.
Yes. Well, what is the Nazi serum 525?
Well, we have talked about that before. That was, I think, a way long time ago in Cosmic War. But for our context here, where we're sort of putting it into the context of a modern alchemy, the Nazis were after, I believe, in the Bell device, a gateway technology that would allow them to engineer the fabric of space-time directly and locally. All right?
Yeah.
Now, if you look at everything that's in the fabric of space-time, everything within it is rotating. Okay? The secret, in other words, is rotation.
Yes.
And this serum 525 was the substance that they put inside this Bell device and spun up to high speeds inside of these mechanically rotating mechanically counter-rotating metal drums. The serum itself was composed of most likely mercury in some isotope and then thorium or beryllium oxides. And there's thorium again, all right? Yeah, there we are. The thorium oxide, I believe, was an oxide of thorium-229 isomer, because that isomer is also doing what? It's spinning.
Yes.
So you spin all this stuff up inside these metal drums and pulse it. And I believe that this, for the Nazis, represented a kind of an alchemy. Because, of course, mercury being one of the ingredients is a component of all alchemical practice. And the oxide and the pulsing it with electricity and so on and so forth and subjecting it to extreme pressure. Well, if you read alchemical texts, these are precisely the types of operations that you find alchemists describing in them. High heat, intense pressure, and all of this stuff. I think this is what the Nazis were doing. They were quite literally, I think, basing a part of their thinking behind the Bell device on having read some of these alchemical texts. And that serum was, so to speak, their philosopher's stone that made that technology work. Now, I want to add one more thing that's very important. In the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, I reproduce a little article that appeared in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in 1924 that was written by none other than Dr. Walter Gerlach. Now, for people who don't know who Dr. Gerlach was, he was one of the most famous physicists at that time in history. His fame was as well known in the scientific community as Albert Einstein. And he helped another physicist by the name of Stern, perform an experiment that actually won Stern the Nobel Prize. So in other words, Gerlach is not a second stringer. Well, in this article that he wrote for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in 1924, he pointed out, and this is very important, that mercury, when subjected to intense electrical stress and bombardment, would oftentimes transmute minute amounts of mercury into gold.
Oh.
And he himself called it a neue alchemy, a new alchemy. Now, the reason all of this is important is because it was precisely Dr. Walter Gerlach who was the project head of the Bell. Wow. So, yes, we are dealing, I think, when you connect all these little dots, GeorgeAnn, we are dealing not only with an exotic advanced technology that was inspired in part by certain papers within physics and engineering between the war, but I definitely believe that part of the inspiration for this project came from the fact that these Nazi scientists also were looking at ancient texts, particularly Sanskrit texts that were talking about mercury vortices and so on, and reading them and decoding them from the standpoint of what they knew in terms of modern physics in some of these papers. That's precisely what's going on.
Oh my.
We have, in other words, a kind of Greater German Alchemical Reich. In fact, that's actually the name of one of the chapters in the Philosopher's Stone.
Well, did the Nazis produce gold alchemically, gold in sufficient quantities to be minted?
Ah, boy.
Yeah.
You get the blue ribbon tonight, GeorgeAnn, for opening up such a whopper of Pandora's box.
Yeah.
Well, to begin with, there was and I recount this episode in the Philosopher's Stone, there was an episode involving a German alchemist by the name of Franz Tausend, who actually was commissioned by one of the early Nazi leaders, a fellow by the name of General Erich Ludendorff, who was actually the last supreme commander of the German armed forces during World War I, and an early supporter of Adolf Hitler between the wars. In fact, Ludendorff participated with Hitler in the 1923 Munich Beer Hall Putsch, So Ludendorff commissioned this guy, Tausend, to transmute a bunch of gold, all right?
Oh, boy.
Now, transmute a bunch of mercury into gold. And, in fact, Ludendorff paid him 100,000 marks to do this.
Oh, boy.
You know, back then that was a tidy little $33,000.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So, anyway, Tausend claimed that he did this, but for some reason, it's very obscure in the records. For some reason, Tausend failed to fulfill his Nazi master's wishes, and there was a big trial for fraud inside the Weimar Republic. And this went on for several years.
Oh, my.
But meanwhile, this is where it gets really interesting. Because SS General Oswald's Pole, and I reproduce this document in the book, he claimed that the SS had, in fact, learned the secrets of alchemical transmutation of base metals into gold, and that Himmler had set up a bunch of these little alchemical laboratories all over the Reich where they were doing nothing but making lots and lots of gold. Okay?
Oh, my gosh.
Now, what I find extremely suspicious is my own research. I've never published this, but my own research has led me to a very, very tentative, and I do want listeners to understand, I'm underlining and italicizing and bold-facing the word tentative here, okay, has led me to a very tentative conclusion that the amount of gold that the Nazis confiscated from Jews and other concentration camp inmates, and then, you know, prying out gold fillings from their teeth and melting it down into ingots and all of the stuff that the Nazis did.
Yeah.
My research tentatively leads me to conclude that this does not account for all of the gold that is reputed that the Nazis actually had.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
There is an excess amount of gold here that cannot, in my opinion, be rationalized solely on the basis of their plundering the gold reserves of the various nations that they conquered and, you know, the gold fillings that they're prying out of dead people's teeth.
Right, right.
There's something else that was going on. So you stitch all this together, the kind of technologies they were investigating, the statements of Dr. Walter Gerlach, the kind of technology they're investigating in the Bell, the kinds of esoteric texts that they're reading. It may be, I have found no evidence for this, but it may be that they did come up with some sort of transmutational technology.
Oh my gosh.
It's a whopper. But I'm fairly confident in saying that because I do reproduce the fact in the Philosopher's Stone that Siemens and Halske, the big German electronics firm, took out a number of patents precisely on transmutational processes of mercury into gold.
Oh my goodness.
Oh yes, they're legitimate pre-World War II German patents to do this. Now, what's really odd is that you don't hear anything more once the Third Reich starts up of any research that is being done in this area other than Oswald Pohl's little statement.
Yeah.
But you also don't hear, and Siemens to this day is very, very hesitant to talk about anything that they were doing for the Third Reich during the war. You can pry very little out of that company.
Oh my gosh, Joseph.
Yeah. Yeah, it sort of leaves one stammering and stuttering.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. The gold that they made off with was far in excess of what they, on the surface, would have had access to.
Yeah, I think so. You know, that's where my research has... I have not published any of those things I've been digging around in simply because I have not satisfied myself that it's conclusive enough to put out in the form of an argued case. But I've outlined the basic problems that led me along this line of research. But as to whether or not I'll ever be able to come up with anything substantial enough to turn into a book is another matter.
Oh boy, and I'll bet it's not, I'll bet if the core was drilled, it wouldn't be lead or some other...
Exactly.
It would be pure.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
Well, again, this is the other aspect of this alchemical technology, because, again, you can take a tunable gas laser and separate elements, isotopes of elements, by means of that process, and it is always very, very pure in its result.
Oh my gosh!
With that technology, they would have been able to enrich uranium to a purity far beyond anything that the Allies were doing with the technologies available to them.
Yes.
In other words, you would have been able to have a smaller critical mass and gotten a much larger bang out of it. And that, again, why are they doing that? Well, obviously, smaller mass means a smaller bomb. You can put them on your rockets. Yeah.
Gee. Oh my gosh. If they would just use technologies for the betterment of the world, it would be so great. But it seems like everything they do is destruction.
Yeah, well, the sad fact is, if I'm right about the history of the laser, then its original conception was as a weapon. But fortunately, as we all know, that is a technology that can be used for a great deal of good, and has been. So, even if it's a trivial little good, as like a laser pointer during presentation.
Let your cat chase it.
Let your cat chase a little dot of light on the floor. Exactly.
Yeah. Joseph, what is super dense matter?
Oh boy. This also has some alchemical connections. Because in the Philosopher's Stone, I point out that one of the properties of the Philosopher's Stone was its indestructibility.
Yes.
In other words, if something is going to be indestructible, it would have to be, by the nature of the case, much more dense in terms of its lattice structure than ordinary matter. You'd have atoms packed into every little nook and cranny of empty space, in other words.
Yeah.
Okay? Well, there are theories within physics that when stars die and collapse, sometimes they can collapse down to nothing larger than a cubic centimeter, all right?
Oh, my goodness.
And yet have the mass of an entire star.
Oh.
There are such theories. And, it's kind of one step away from a black hole.
Yeah.
All right. You've got this super matter that, would be impossible for anyone to lift. Well, the Nazi connection here is that there was this very, very odd Japanese cable from Stockholm to Tokyo during World War II in 1943, where the Japanese military attaché is cabling information to Tokyo that he's apparently learned from reading various articles in British newspapers and from his contacts with, his Nazi counterparts there in Stockholm and so on and so forth. And he cables Tokyo that the Nazis apparently were working on the atom bomb, but he says something very peculiar, and that is that they are doing so in connection with super dense matter, such as might be found in a dwarf star.
Oh.
That basically is paraphrasing what he says.
Yeah.
So in other words, we have another indicator that the Nazis were looking into all sorts of exotic materials for weapons. Now, frankly, I personally doubt that they achieved anything like, the matter that you would get in a collapsed star. But the interesting thing about that serum 525 and its composition from mercury and thorium oxide is that if they were able successfully to have a reactor technology, if they had put that substance inside of a nuclear reactor and bombarded it with slow neutrons, those neutrons would kind of stick to the nucleus of these atoms, and the matter would become more dense. It would not lose its chemical composition, but it would become a more dense form of matter. It could be conceivably also pressurized and so on and so forth. They were also looking into other ways to make super dense matter, and that's through the use of supercooling, in other words, cryogenic cooling. So, they were pursuing, GeorgeAnn, almost every conceivable way that you can think of to come up with very exotic weapons technologies, including super dense matter.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh! Between that and the gold.
Yes, it's more jaw-dropping stuff. But This is all true. And again, I've laid out this story in several of the books on the Nazi stuff. But the key here, for our purposes, is that again, the Nazis appear to me to have been reading some of these ancient texts, and in particular alchemical texts, where they get this idea of the indestructibility of the Philosopher's Stone, and voila, a physicist reading that is going to say, well, that's super dense matter. It's matter with a lattice structure much more densely packed than a diamond.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Taking a step back,
yes.
The triune stone, the Grail, the Fleece, and Cosmic War, what all does that have in common?
In common with what? With each other?
Yeah.
Well, it's my opinion that if you read alchemical texts and ancient myths, such as the Golden Fleece, carefully, and read them with alchemical eyes, that what you have with things like the Golden Fleece are precisely alchemical references, all right? The Golden Fleece, of course, being what Jason and the Argonauts were after in Greek mythology. But the triune stone is oftentimes the way that alchemical texts will refer to the Philosopher's Stone.
Okay.
Because in alchemical texts, it takes three different forms. One is as a liquid. One is as a fine, fine white powder. And then finally you have the idea that it's a solidus, an actual stone. Okay? So there are some, pardon me, there are some texts that refer to it as the triune stone simply because it has three different forms in which it can exist. And that, to me, again, tells me that the alchemists were really, in a certain sense, talking about a very exotic form of matter that would exist in three different states.
Oh.
Or could exist in three different states, I should say.
Well, there's an alchemical war to control the technology of time. To harness the secrets of time.
Well, yes, I mentioned that at the very, very end of The Philosopher's Stone. There have always been, GeorgeAnn, persistent rumors that the Nazis were doing some sort of experimentation or research into the control and manipulation of time.
Oh,
all right?
dear.
And, yeah, oh dear is right. And I sketch out these rumors, particularly in Secrets of the Unified Field, and then later in The Philosopher's Stone, right at the end of the book. And I even mention it in passing in connection with a novel by Dean Koontz, the famous novelist, in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. Because one of his novels, called Lightning, is precisely about a wartime Nazi project to develop, in his thinking, a time machine by which you could travel, sort of like the television series Stargate.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Well, in his version of this technology, it to me is eerie, because he describes a technology where they use a rotating drum and lots of electricity. Is this ringing a bell?
Yeah.
He describes this technology precisely that way. Well, it's interesting because his novel appears 4 years, I think, before anything is known at all about the Nazi Bell Project, because at the time he published the novel, Germany hadn't been reunified, and all that eastern zone and all those people were not free to tell their stories.
Oh, my gosh.
So in other words, I think that he knew something, but he's never disclosed where he got the idea or how he found out about this. The second little thing that I do know is that there were conversations, and I reproduce this story in Secrets of the Unified Field, that a NASA scientist who was a German scientist had told someone about an actual experiment that the Germans were conducting in the Harz Mountains concerning the nature of time. Okay? And I reproduce that whole story there. Well, what's one of the code names for the Nazi Bell? Project Kronos. Project Time. And the bell was located in installations in the Harz Mountains. Okay?
Yeah.
So in other words, I think, again, we have all these clues that were being let out prior to the actual project itself being discovered, because the project fits so many of the clues that already existed. So, what I get to is that the Bell Project, in its goal to attempt to control gravity, well, any time, GeorgeAnn, that you are tinkering around with the geometry to control gravity, you are, by the nature of the case, tinkering around with time.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, you don't have to go any further than Albert Einstein's general relativity to see this.
My goodness.
So in other words, the basic physics theory was known since 1916 when he published his paper. What the Nazis did, contrary to everyone's thinking, when they decried Jewish physics, contrary to everyone's thinking, what they were really trying to decry was that it was simply not engineerable. But, as I've documented in Secrets of the Unified Field, there is certainly enough of a case to be made that the existing physics literature and engineering literature at the time would have led them to the conclusion that, hey, yeah, we can do this right here on planet Earth with existing technology. And they did.
They can engineer time.
Yeah, sure.
Oh.
What is torsion? Torsion is a spiraling, folding, and pleating in the fabric of space-time.
Oh.
What is the bell? And let me back up. What else is torsion? Torsion is nothing but a system of counter-rotation.
Oh.
That's all it is.
Yeah.
It's just the aluminum soda can that you've emptied and you're wringing it like a dish rag in your hands. That's torsion, folks.
Yeah. Oh.
And the can is space-time. Well, what's the bell doing? It's taking all this high-spinning stuff and spinning it up real fast, pulsing it electrically, putting it under electrical stress and pressure. Voila, there's your torsion.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It's a very alchemical technology.
What can they do with it?
Well, we've covered that numerous times before. The Nazis are after three things with it. They're after a free energy technology, a technology that can tap into the zero-point energy.
Yeah.
They're after a field propulsion anti-gravity technology for advanced space travel. And the final thing, of course, is they're after a doomsday weapon.
Oh, a doomsday weapon.
Well, of course, because if you can engineer the fabric of space-time locally, potentially, GeorgeAnn, I've said this many times, potentially, you have a weapons potential there that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker.
Oh, dear. Oh.
And, Nazis being Nazis.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to have, for all this other stuff, but gee, golly gosh, wouldn't it be cool, mein Führer? You see, we got to remember we're dealing here with pretty sick people. They may be brilliant, but they're also pretty sick. Twisted, yes.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, is the medium, is it constant or does it fluctuate?
It fluctuates.
Okay.
It fluctuates. Yeah, this is the big difference between this sort of on the sidelines 20th century ether physics and the kind of ether they were thinking about in terms of in the 19th century. And the one really in the 20th century and even in the 19th century that had already concluded that the physical medium, so to speak, fluctuates was actually Nikola Tesla.
Oh.
So in other words, all roads, I've said this before too, all roads lead back to Tesla.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
Oh.
Oh, yes. And, let's look at something else in terms of all of this alchemical technology, because where did the bulk of Tesla's papers go? Well, Yugoslavia. Who invaded Yugoslavia in May of 1941?
Yeah. The Nazis.
Yeah, you got it.
Oh, my gosh. Paracelsus.
Yes.
He made a statement that the fragmentation of knowledge occurred after the deluge.
Yes. 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 And what do you want me to say about that?
Whatever your heart desires.
Well, Paracelsus, to me, is one of the most fascinating of all the alchemists of the West.
Yeah.
He was, in his way, he was every bit as much the Renaissance man as Leonardo da Vinci, and he was every bit as much the scientist and alchemist as Isaac Newton a century after him.
Yeah.
But he was unabashedly and unapologetically an alchemist. He said in, I forget which of his texts, he tended to write texts with these very long titles. So
Yeah.
I'm not even going to attempt to remember what the title of this was. It's in the Philosopher's Stone somewhere. But, the title is almost an entire paragraph in itself. But anyway, he stated that after the deluge, the lost knowledge of that very high civilization that existed before the deluge was fragmented, and that the Egyptians got the alchemical component. The Babylonians and Mesopotamians received the astrological component, or if you prefer, the astronomical one.
Yeah.
And the Hebrews received the Kabbalistic component. All right? For him to have said that, I think, GeorgeAnn, implies that he also knew something else.
Oh, yes.
And that is that the Tower of Babel moment and the Deluge moment, if we may call them that, were intimately connected events. They were more or less two parts to one story. I think this is very much the way that he viewed things. And given his knowledge of some texts, some of which, incidentally, are simply lost to us.
Yes.
Given his knowledge of alchemical texts, it would not surprise me that he knew something else, but unfortunately, anybody's guess is as good as anyone else's as to what it may have been for him to say something like that.
Boy.
Yeah.
He was a very brilliant thinker.
Yeah, he was very brilliant, very quirky.
Yeah.
But very brilliant nonetheless.
I have some facsimiles that were taken from the British Museum.
Yes.
Of his text. And you're right, the titles are...
Yes, they do go on.
Sapphire is mentioned a lot in biblical texts.
Yes.
And the Russians used a large artificial sapphire to measure the fluctuations of the Earth's gravitational acceleration.
Yes. Yes.
What's important about a sapphire?
Well, it's the lattice structure of the crystal.
Oh.
Sapphire and ruby. I think we briefly touched on this in the previous section, as a matter of fact. Sapphire and ruby are, just to refresh everybody's memory, are the same chemical compound, corundum. All right. The difference in the color that they give off is simply due to the nature of impurities and lattice defects in the composition of the crystal. All right. But sapphire and ruby are second only to diamonds in terms of their hardness, but given the peculiarities of the crystal, sapphires are very, very responsive to very minute fluctuations in the local gravitational field of the Earth. Now, why is that important? Because, if you recall way, way back in the Cosmic War series, I mentioned that crystals are natural resonators to the torsion field fluctuations of planet Earth. All right?
Yes.
And when they grow, they reflect those fluctuations precisely by those lattice defects in their structure as they grow. That's what they're responding to. This is why, in my opinion, it's very interesting that we have NASA and other space agencies growing crystals in outer space.
Yes.
Because I think what they're trying to do in part is to learn more accurately the nature of torsion-based physics laws by experimental empirical observation.
Yeah.
And secondly, they're trying to grow crystals that do not have the same types of lattice defects as crystals grown here under the Earth's gravity.
Yeah.
So they will grow differently in space. They will grow, so to speak, more perfectly. All right? Cleaner, yes. Yeah. But sapphire is, just by the nature of its structure, is very responsive to these fields.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
Well, the philosopher's Mercury can manipulate materia prima.
Yes, well, that's the whole point of the philosopher's stone.
And what was interesting that you mentioned last time, Joseph, is that the effects of the philosopher's stone can be felt at a distance.
Yes. I have a whole kind of catalog of the various powers claimed for the philosopher's stone at the very beginning of my book by that title. One of them being indestructibility, the other being conferral of longevity and healing properties, and the third being this ability to effect action at a distance. All right. Mm-hmm. The reason for this is if we look at the physics thinking behind what the alchemists believed they were after.
Yeah.
They believed that everything descended from this materia prima, this prime matter, which is an undifferentiated physical substrate to all matter.
Yes.
That's like saying it's a physical nothing, because if it's undifferentiated, you can't observe any distinctions within it, and therefore it is a nothing. All right?
Yeah.
So they had a very different understanding of what creation ex nihilo meant. It meant, yes, out of nothing, but in their thinking it was a physical nothing. It was a real existing matter, but because it possessed no distinguishing characteristics, you couldn't distinguish anything with it, so therefore it's still a nothing. Okay? All right?
Yeah.
But this goes all the way back to Egyptian thinking, because this is precisely the way they viewed it. They simply called it the duat, all right, the ma'at.
Yeah.
The medium in their thinking created information. Once you differentiate that nothing, in other words, just pretend you kind of come along and thump it, all right? The thumping action is going to send out waves within that medium. And those waves, of course, are going to be features that will distinguish various regions of it. All right? So in other words, the very act of thumping, the very act of even thinking about it, creates a thump in it. And that begins the process of differentiation. So the physical medium in alchemical thinking creates information, number one, and as it is doing so, it transmutes itself into ever more specific things, all based on the principle of vibration.
Oh,
now, this is, if this is sounding horribly modern,
yeah,
that's exactly my point. It is horribly modern.
Oh, my gosh.
But it is actually very ancient. So in other words, when you're looking at these alchemical texts that are talking about the transmutation of elements or the transmutation of the consciousness, what they're telling you is this is all based in a physics, which is what we've been saying all along.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, here comes the curveball. If that's the case, then it also means that alchemy is a certain technique of social engineering once you understand the physics.
Oh, my gosh.
So, we're right back to what we've talked about before in terms of connection to astrology, in terms of connection to planetary positions, their effect on physical systems. We're back to what we discussed in Babylon's Banksters with the templates and so on and so forth. And, of course, what is the word template? It comes from the word tempus, which is the Latin for time, which is the basis for the word temple. What were temples connected with back then? Well, pretty much all of them were connected in one way or another to some sort of astronomical alignment.
Yes.
Some sort of astrological dedication.
Yeah.
So in other words, this is all connected. The clues have all been there all along. It's just that we have to learn to connect the dots properly.
Oh, gosh. Well, the Holy Trinity as an it rather than a full-fledged person.
Yes. Persons, plural, not person.
The Augustinized, Trinitized formula that began to influence Western Christianity down to this day.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very interesting, Joseph.
Well, as I've pointed out in The Philosopher's Stone, people have to understand, and I even hate getting into this because, again, it's going to sound like I'm doing nothing but beating up on a particular group or class of Christians, all right? And I'm not trying to do that.
Yes.
But what people have to understand is that all Western Christianity, every last form of it, from your local self-appointed hang-up-the-shingle on a storefront building in a strip mall preacher to the most high-ranking cardinal archbishop in the Roman Catholic Church, okay? All Western Christians have been influenced by a doctrine of the Trinity that is unique only to the Western Church, and moreover, it is not the original doctrine of the Trinity. It was the doctrine as formulated by St. Augustine of Hippo Regius in the late 4th and early 5th centuries A.D., okay?
Yes.
This is so crucial because if you look at the way he formulated the doctrine, the Greek fathers, when they learned of it, said that the formulation was more appropriate to, quote, sensory things, unquote. In other words, what they were saying is the formulation of this doctrine is more appropriate to physics than to theology.
Yes.
All right? It is not the doctrine of the Eastern churches, and never has been the doctrine. In fact, it is this peculiar formulation of the doctrine in the West that ultimately led the Eastern Orthodox churches to excommunicate the Western church, to just simply break communion with it altogether.
Yeah.
And, it spills over, GeorgeAnn, into the way Western Christians think about the atonement, into the way they think about the doctrine of original sin. It has absolutely far-reaching, almost endless implications.
Yes.
We could just go on and on and on with this. But for our purposes here, the thing that I point out in the Philosopher's Stone is that the way that Augustine formulated the doctrine, even down to the way it's pictorially represented in so many Western Christian churches, is nothing else than straight out of esoteric occult texts called the Hermetica.
Yes.
And that the doctrine has nothing whatsoever to do with Christianity in the way he formulated it.
Yeah.
Okay? Because it's nothing but a physics. So, that should give people a lot of pause.
Yes.
It should make them really question and dig deeply into history. Get your noses out of the Bible and the way that you've been taught to interpret it thanks to this doctrine. And really dig into history and some other texts to see what I'm saying, because it is true. And I lay out part of that case in the Philosopher's Stone.
Yes, and you do it beautifully.
Well, I did so without getting into the nasty implications, because I didn't want people to get sidetracked with theological issues. That to keep the focus on the physics.
Well, what is the world soul?
Well, the world soul is a particular conception within certain systems of ancient classical philosophy, most particularly within the philosophical school called Neoplatonism. And again, there are similarities between that philosophical school and the way that the Western doctrine of the Trinity was formulated by Augustine of Hippo. Because in one of its classic formulations within Neoplatonism that was done by a fellow by the name of Plotinus, he had three supreme entities, and they were as follows: the One, and then there was an entity called the Nous, or the intellect, and then there was an entity called the world soul, which was kind of the soul of all souls, okay?
Yeah.
All right? In other words, it's the underlying soul behind any creature having a soul, all right, including human beings. The One in Plotinus's thinking has absolutely no distinctions. In other words, it is his word for this absolutely undifferentiated physical medium. The intellect has only two distinctions, in that it is a self that knows itself. All right? That's all it is. And the world soul comes out of that knowledge of itself. It's a self that knows itself and knows it's knowing itself, so to speak.
Oh, boy.
Okay? So in other words, you keep introducing more distinctions, and with each introduction of a distinction, you get a little further away into more distinction and less unity, all right? But yeah, the world soul is this sort of third entity on the totem pole within that system.
Well, back engineering the topological descent,
yes,
in order to confect and embody the medium more immediately in a creature,
yes,
in the Philosopher's Stone. It made me think that we are all conscious beings, are all, in a sense, Philosopher's Stones.
Yes, this is a very, very alchemical view.
Yeah.
All right, and it's the view of ancient Egypt and so many other cultures. All right, because, again, their view is that everything derives from this materia prima, from this primal nothingness that nevertheless has an existence, but you just simply can't know anything about it because it's undifferentiated. All right? It's a real physical, non-observable. The reference there to topological descent is, if you look at this whole structure mathematically, topologically, as I sort of simplistically do in the Philosopher's Stone. I have a slightly fuller version of it in an appendix in the Giza Death Star Destroyed. But essentially what I show, first of all, is you can take the language of these ancient metaphysical texts and simply substitute mathematical notation for very specific concepts. In other words, you are looking within these texts at a very carefully disguised, hidden mathematical metaphor. All right? You can actually formally notate this stuff in topology. Now, as you do so, as each thing is differentiated from another thing, it increases the amount of mathematical description. In other words, you have a bunch of symbols on the page and you use a lot more symbols to describe the next thing emerging, all right?
Yes.
That's kind of a simplistic way of putting it. Well, this whole process means that if you read those symbols, if you read the mathematics, you can figure out where a specific thing comes from. You can sort of, so to speak, trace the development that led you to this point and then work backwards. And that's essentially what alchemy is attempting to do. It's trying to reverse engineer that process of descent of specific things from the physical medium itself, precisely in order to embody as much of the properties of that physical medium directly within actual matter. That's what they're doing. So in other words, it's all physics again.
Oh, wow.
But yes, it's a very alchemical view to say that every conscious being, in a certain sense, is a manifestation of that physical medium.
And that's why what we think
can affect it, yes.
Can affect it. And
yes.
When we all go around, the world is coming to an end, the sky is falling.
Bingo.
We bring it into fruition.
Yes, and this is why in alchemy there's a branch of it called esoteric alchemy, in which you read the symbolisms of alchemical texts as referring to the human consciousness itself and its transmutation. In other words, what they're telling you is that you have to have an elevated, enlightened consciousness of, pure gold, so to speak, or in other words, of light, so that, you don't go around hating people and thinking negative things, because the effect on the medium is direct and immediate.
Yes.
Yeah, it's if I put it out there, if all of that is true, and scientists are working in these areas even as we speak, and they're coming to some very amazing conclusions that definitely tend to suggest it is true. If all that be true, then it is a very dangerous thing that we're talking about here.
Oh, yes.
Very dangerous.
Well, and that's also why Jesus Christ said where two or more
are gathered together, yes.
Yes, in my name.
Because, yes, the simple physical explanation, or if you prefer topological explanation, would be that a group consciousness has a much more powerful effect on the medium if it is united with certain conceptions, intentions, and so on.
Yes.
Than would an individual.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness, just...
Now, mind you, I'm not trying to portray Christ or his teachings in alchemical terms, but that's the way an alchemist would look at them.
Yes.
That's the way certain physicists within modern physics would look at them, look at statements like that.
Yeah. You never fail to amaze me.
Well, it's also if you directly affect the medium by your thoughtful intentions.
Yes.
And if groups directly affect the medium by their thoughtful intentions, then you have the basis in those presuppositions that alchemy or alchemical techniques are also techniques of social engineering.
Yeah.
That's where our danger comes. Look at all of these nutty apocalyptices trying to read the tea leaves and predicting the end of the world.
Yeah.
It's very disturbing to me, GeorgeAnn.
Yeah, it's disturbing to me too. When we can change things.
Yes.
If there are enough of us that have that intention.
Yes, it's the old adage: change your thinking, change your heart, and the world will change around you.
And as a man thinketh,
so is he. Yeah.
Oh boy.
And again, that's a very alchemical statement. It's just because there's a certain class of Christian or Christianity out there that cuts itself so utterly off from any sort of connection with historical texts and interpretations that they miss entirely how much their own Bible is loaded with these principles, if looked at a certain way.
Yeah, you're right. Oh, God bless you, Joseph, for...
Thank you. You too, GeorgeAnn.
Oh, thanks for what you bring to the table. And it's just... you are amazing. You are truly brilliant, Joseph.
Oh, thank you.
And
I wasn't responsible for that. That's Mom and Dad. I get my looks and mine from my father, and my love of music and I hope my peaceful attitude and gentleness from my mother. So
yes.
I didn't have much to do with it. I'm just here.
You're just here.
I'm just here.
You're a philosopher's stone.
Well, we all are.
It's amazing that the part where we talked about the fact that the stone can heal at a distance.
Yes, well, again, if you are connected to the physical medium, let's look at what the physical medium in that undifferentiated state is.
Okay.
It's non-local.
Yes. Because
locality would be what? Differentiation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So in other words, the physical medium is always non-local. Always. If you have some technique, if you have by some technology affected a chunk of matter that taps directly into that property, then yes, it will be able to affect things at a distance. And if you read carefully the papers of physicist Hal Puthoff, the physicist that was involved with the remote viewing project at SRI, he wrote this little paper called Remote Perception of Sensory Objects at Distance, or something like that, I think it was entitled. Well, if you read what he's saying carefully, what he's telling you is that remote viewing does nothing but tap into that non-local property of the medium, in which all and from which all information comes. In other words, he's telling you there's a physics basis behind the old occult idea, old esoteric doctrine of the Akashic records.
Yes.
Of, the records of everything that ever has been, will be, or is now.
Yeah.
That no information, and this is something that emerges in a certain sense from the topology, once any specific set of information is created, it is never lost. It is always present in potential in the physical medium itself.
Oh, amazing.
That has massive, truly, truly massive implications.
Well, I think that somebody has a hold of one of these stones and they're using it on Washington, D.C.
No comment, GeorgeAnn.
It's amazing, Joseph. People get elected and they seem perfectly sane and, and then they go up there to Washington, D.C., and they turn into a loony bin.
Well, I think you could make a case. I'm not going to get into this in detail.
Okay.
But I think you could make a case that there is an esoteric environment in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
that contributes to that state of mind.
Oh, gee.
And, Lord Acton's adage was that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes.
But in my opinion, GeorgeAnn, it's the opposite. It is the corrupt seek power.
Oh, yeah.
And the absolutely corrupt seek absolute power.
Yeah.
So in other words, anyone running for any office, I'm immediately suspicious of by the nature of the case.
Yes.
Because, if your motivating goal in life is power over others, then watch out.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just to me one of those axioms, and the corollary, of course, is that once you become connected, as far as I'm concerned, once you become connected with the government, you're guilty until you prove yourself innocent.
Yeah. That's a good one. A lot of truth there.
Well, it certainly flies in the face of Anglo-American jurisprudence, but nonetheless, I think there's probably a human lesson in there somewhere.
Oh, Joseph Farrell. Dr. Farrell, thank you.
Well, thank you for having me back on, GeorgeAnn.
Oh.
Fun as always.
Yes, we do have fun. And everybody, go to Joseph Farrell's personal website, Giza Death Star. There is a PayPal button there. He is beginning a huge project. And he needs the funds to sustain himself through this and to get the research materials that he needs. So I'm asking, please donate generously. And you will hear about it when it's done, and you'll hear about it here on the Byte Show.
And please, folks, make some donations to GeorgeAnn. And again, I do want to thank all those beautiful people that helped in this move. You do not know how grateful I am, and God bless you all.
God bless everyone out there with ears to hear. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.